The night the war officially ended, the North Sea was eerily quiet. The fog rolled low over the water like breath held in the chest of a dying giant. It was May 8, 1945, Tag der Capitulation, the day of surrender. Across Europe, the guns had fallen silent, and the radio waves that once crackled with orders now carried only static and disbelief. For the men aboard U-977, the news arrived like a voice from another world. Deep beneath the gray Atlantic, the crew sat crowded in the narrow metal belly of their Type WWII submarine. The electric hum of the batteries was the only sound. Diesel fumes clung to the air, thick and bitter. Their commander, Oberleutnant Heinz Schäffer, was 24 years old, too young to look like a captain, but already old in the way that war makes men old. When he gathered his crew that evening, the men's faces were pale in the dim red light. They waited for his words, for direction, for some reason to keep moving. Schäffer read the message slowly. It was official. The Reich had surrendered. Hitler was dead. All U-boats were to surface, hoist black flags, and surrender themselves to the Allies. Any ship that continued combat would be treated as pirate, outside all laws of war. For a long while, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of air through the vents, and the creak of metal under pressure. Finally, one sailor, an engineer named Lothar, whispered, "So that's it then." But it wasn't. Not yet. Not for them. Schäffer stared at the chart table for a long time after dismissing the crew. He was thinking of what surrender would mean: captivity, interrogation, humiliation. The Allied navies were already rounding up submarines across the Atlantic. And there were rumors of German crews being mistreated, even executed, at sea. The young commander could not bear the thought of raising a white flag. He had spent his youth training for a cause that had dissolved in smoke. Now, all that remained was a steel coffin drifting under a conquered ocean. That night, as the submarine rocked gently on the dark water, Schäffer made a decision that would seal his name into legend. He would not surrender. He would flee. But where could a hunted submarine go? The oceans were crawling with Allied ships. The ports of Europe were occupied or destroyed. And the U-boat fleet, once the terror of the seas, was now a collection of ghosts. There was only one place far enough, remote enough, still sympathetic to remnants of the old Germany: Argentina. The idea was wild, even desperate. From the Norwegian coast to the shores of South America was over 7,000 miles of open ocean, a journey that would take months, without refueling, under constant threat of detection. But Schäffer was not alone in his defiance. Among his crew were men who had lost everything: families gone, cities destroyed, futures erased. The sea was the only home left to them. And the thought of surrender, of turning themselves over to their enemies, was more unbearable than the thought of dying beneath the waves. So, on May 10, 1945, 3 days after Germany's surrender, U-977 slipped quietly out of her hiding place in Norway. Her engines murmured low, her wake vanished quickly into the dark. The voyage had begun, not toward victory, not even toward home, but toward a strange kind of survival. Above deck, the sky was gray and endless. The North Sea smelled of rust and salt. The crew worked silently, as if in a trance. Even the gulls seemed to avoid them, as though they knew this was not a voyage of the living. For safety, Schäffer ordered the U-boat to remain submerged for as long as possible, using the snorkel system to take in air for the diesels. It was claustrophobic, a narrow cylinder of stale air, condensation dripping constantly from the steel walls. The days and nights blended. There was no sunrise or sunset down there, only the red glow of instruments, the ticking of gauges, and the rhythmic pulse of the propeller shafts. Men whispered instead of speaking. They ate in silence, each lost in thought. Schäffer later wrote in his memoir, "It was not madness that drove us south, only the refusal to live as prisoners. We were young and proud, but mostly, we were afraid of what awaited us if we returned." Outside, the ocean pressed against the hull with the weight of the world. Every sound, every creak, every ripple, felt magnified in that silence. Yet for all its dangers, the sea also offered them protection. Beneath its surface, they were invisible. As the submarine moved slowly down the coast of Europe, avoiding patrols, the world above them began to change. Germany was divided. Berlin was rubble. The war crimes trials had begun. But deep below, U-977 carried on as if time itself had stopped. Weeks passed. The men grew pale and weary. Beards thickened. The air smelled of diesel and metal. But each day, the thought of freedom, or at least escape, pushed them onward. They surfaced only at night, in the black hours before dawn, to take in fresh air and to look at the stars. Those nights were sacred, a reminder that the world still existed beyond steel and silence. Some of the men wrote letters they would never send. Others stood on deck, staring at the faint glow of the Milky Way, wondering if anyone would ever know what became of them. They passed the Bay of Biscay unseen, then turned west, toward the vast emptiness of the Atlantic. One by one, the crew began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could reach the far side of the world. But as the days stretched into weeks, the sea began to take its toll, on body, mind, and spirit. And so began the longest, strangest voyage of the war, a journey through the twilight between defeat and defiance, between duty and exile. The voyage of U-977, the submarine that refused to surrender. But even the strongest steel bends under time and pressure. In the next part, we'll descend deeper, into the cramped silence of U-977's world, where men learned to live in darkness, and where the dream of escape began to blur with the edge of madness. For most of us, the word underwater simply means silence, a held breath, a moment of quiet. But for the crew of U-977, it became an entire world, a floating coffin of steel and shadows. When Heinz Schäffer gave the order to dive on that May morning in 1945, the sea swallowed the submarine whole. The last glimpse of daylight, a pale streak across the Norwegian horizon, slipped away like a curtain closing on civilization itself. The ocean above them sealed shut. And for the next 66 days, they would not see the sky again. The decision to remain submerged for that long was not part of any naval manual. It was desperation mixed with stubborn hope. Schäffer knew that Allied planes and destroyers were still combing the North Atlantic, hunting for U-boats that hadn't yet surrendered. To surface was to invite discovery, a flare in the darkness, a signal that their defiance still breathed. And so U-977 descended into its own kind of exile, a drifting silence beneath the roaring world. Inside the hull, space was precious. The Type WWII was only 67 meters long, a narrow cylinder crammed with engines, batteries, torpedoes, and men. 48 crew members shared 2 small wash basins, 1 tiny galley, and no comfort at all. The air was thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. As the days passed, the oxygen thinned, replaced by the heavy breath of 48 lungs. Condensation dripped from every surface, falling onto bunks, food, and skin alike. The air was so damp that paper went limp and mold spread like a second skin along the walls. The men learned to move softly. Footsteps were a luxury. The clang of a dropped wrench could feel like a cannon blast in that enclosed world. They spoke in whispers, sometimes in gestures. Every sound seemed amplified by the metal skin around them. Meals were mechanical: tinned meat, stale bread, powdered potatoes. The cook, a quiet man named Oscar, did his best to lift morale, but the galley's smell never changed, always something between rust and smoke. The days blurred. The electric clocks ticked, but no one trusted them. Without sunlight, time melted into an endless dusk. Men slept when they could, wherever they could. Some dreamed of home, of wives, of rivers, of open air, only to wake in the same gray capsule, the same hum of engines, the same low red light. To mark the days, one of the sailors scratched lines on the wall beside his bunk. When I later read Schäffer's own words about that voyage, I remember his description. The submarine felt alive, not like a machine, but like a creature, breathing and sweating with us. We were inside its lungs. The snorkel system was their lifeline, a metal tube reaching up from the submarine's back, allowing air in for the diesel engines and for the crew to breathe. But the device was fragile, and storms could snap it like a reed. When that happened, they had to rely on the electric motors, draining batteries faster than they could recharge them. On bad nights, waves slammed against the hull so hard that the men thought the sea itself was trying to crush them. The boat would tilt, groan, and shudder. In the control room, Schäffer stood motionless, his eyes on the gauges, his hands steady even when his heart raced. The men respected him, not because he was commanding, but because he never lost that strange calm. He seemed to believe, even in that steel darkness, that the sea had a will of its own, and that if they moved gently it might let them pass. They began to invent rituals to stay sane. Each morning, even without sunlight, the engineer would strike a small bell, 3 soft chimes. It was a habit from before the surrender, a remnant of order. Someone read aloud the day's temperature and battery level, as if they were sailors on a normal voyage. A few men sang, quietly, half under their breath, old songs of Hamburg and Bremen. The notes hung in the air like ghosts. Others retreated into memory. One sailor, a young radio operator named Franz, carried a photograph of his fiancée folded in oilcloth. He would sit by the bulkhead, holding it beneath a red lamp, whispering her name. The others pretended not to notice. The oldest man aboard, Chief Petty Officer Schneider, had been at sea since the first months of the war. He spoke rarely, but once, in a rare conversation with Schäffer, he said, "The sea takes what she wants. The trick is to make her forget you're here." Schäffer nodded, and neither spoke again for a long time. Weeks passed. The boat crept southward, hugging the invisible spine of the Atlantic. They crossed beneath the equator in silence, no ceremony, no celebration. The air grew warmer, heavier. The engines sweated oil. The men's uniforms clung to them like damp rags. By the 45th day, some began to hallucinate. The stillness played tricks on their senses. One sailor swore he heard church bells ringing through the water. Another said he smelled pine trees. In truth, it was the mind reaching for the surface, for anything beyond the metallic hum. To save what sanity remained, Schäffer finally ordered a brief surfacing under cover of night. When the hatch opened, the air rushed in like a revelation, cool, salt-laden, alive. The men clambered up to the deck one by one, blinking against the starlight. For the first time in weeks, they saw the sky, immense, endless, indifferent. The Milky Way arched over them, a pale river of light. Some laughed quietly. One man cried. They bathed in the cold sea water, washed their faces, breathed deeply until their lungs ached. Schäffer stood at the conning tower, eyes closed, feeling the wind brush his face. "This," he whispered, "is what freedom feels like." For a few precious hours, U-977 was no longer a tomb, but a ship again, a vessel gliding beneath a galaxy that did not care who won the war. Then, before dawn, they submerged once more. The hatch sealed with a heavy clang, and the sea reclaimed them. As the 66 days stretched on, small acts of kindness began to matter most. A shared cigarette. A whispered joke. A piece of chocolate saved from weeks ago. Even the faint echo of laughter sounded wholly down there. In his post-war memoir, Schäffer reflected, "We were no longer soldiers of Hitler. We were simply men trying to find a place where the war could not reach us. The ocean was that place, terrible yet pure." The purity, however, came at a cost. The crew began to grow thin and pale. Skin cracked from humidity. Eyes reddened from lack of light. The air compressors wheezed under strain. And still, they pressed on, south, always south. By July, the gauges told them what their bodies already knew: the oxygen mix was deteriorating, and the CO2 filters were nearly spent. They could not remain below any longer. Schäffer decided it was time to risk the surface permanently. When they broke through the waves that night, it was as if the sea exhaled them. The submarine rose into moonlight, battered, streaked with salt, but alive. They opened every hatch, every vent. The men climbed up one by one, gasping, squinting, laughing weakly. For the first time in 2 months, they could see the horizon. And far ahead, somewhere beyond that black line where sky met sea, lay their imagined refuge, Argentina, the far shore of the world. They had survived the unthinkable. Yet the hardest part, crossing the open ocean, hunted by a dozen navies, was still to come. The morning they surfaced for good, the sea was calm, unnervingly calm. It stretched out in every direction, an endless plain of blue-gray silk. The men of U-977 stood on deck, blinking at the sunlight that felt too bright, too clean for men who had lived in shadows. They had been submerged for 66 days, a world record of its kind, and now the Atlantic greeted them not as enemies, but as wanderers who no longer belonged to any flag. Captain Heinz Schäffer looked across the horizon and said quietly, "We have come this far, and the world above still breathes." His voice was thin, cracked by exhaustion, but steady, the tone of a man whose will had survived where reason almost didn't. For the first time since Germany's surrender, the U-boat rode on the surface without fear of depth charges or radar. The war was over, but peace was not yet safe. To understand what they risked, one must imagine the Atlantic in 1945, not as the vast calm we see on a globe, but as a chessboard haunted by unseen pieces. Allied ships still patrolled its waters, ready to intercept any U-boat that dared to linger. Aircraft from Britain, America, and even Brazil watched the trade lanes. And yet U-977 slipped quietly into that post-war twilight, a ghost of a lost war gliding south. Schäffer's destination was Argentina, the one place whispered about among German sailors as a possible refuge. President Juan Perón, fascinated by European military technology and personnel, was said to be open to receiving Germans. Rumors swirled that high-ranking Nazis had already fled there, that secret networks were ready to receive them. But for the men aboard U-977, these were rumors, nothing more. They had no radio contact, no coordinates for sanctuary. Only the compass, the stars, and the captain's faith that land, and life, lay somewhere beyond the southern horizon. Each day followed a rhythm that felt monastic in its simplicity. At dawn, Schäffer would climb to the conning tower, his binoculars scanning the horizon. The sea shimmered in pale gold, and the only sound was the slap of waves against the hull. By midday, the sun grew merciless. The deck plates burned under bare feet. The men stripped off their shirts, skin pale from months without light, and worked in silence. The sea breeze smelled of salt and freedom, but also of something they couldn't name, perhaps guilt, perhaps distance. Food was rationed. They ate whatever had survived the long submersion: hardtack biscuits, powdered soup, coffee substitutes that tasted like warm ash. Fresh water was measured by the cup. Each drop was counted. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the ocean turned to molten copper, they gathered on deck. Some smoked what few cigarettes remained. Others watched the horizon as if expecting the war itself to rise out of the sea and call them back. Night on the Atlantic was both a blessing and a curse. Under the stars, U-977 moved almost invisibly. The crew could navigate by constellations, whispering the old sailors' names: Orion, Southern Cross, Polaris, as if invoking old gods to guide them. The sea at night seemed endless, the stars mirrored in its surface until they could no longer tell sky from water. But every shadow was a potential enemy. Every light on the horizon could be a destroyer, every faint hum the drone of a patrol aircraft. There were times when Schäffer would order the engines cut completely. The U-boat would drift in absolute silence, men holding their breath, listening for propellers. None came, or perhaps they did, and passed them by, unaware that a single submarine still fled through the war's fading echo. One night, around the equator, a storm caught them. The Atlantic transformed in an instant. Wind screamed, waves rose like black mountains. Lightning split the sky, turning the sea into a white, boiling chaos. Below deck, the crew clung to their bunks as water crashed over the conning tower. The boat pitched and rolled violently, its hull creaking under pressure. Diesel engines coughed and sputtered. Tools flew from shelves. In the control room, Schäffer stood with one hand on the periscope column, his knuckles white. The helmsman shouted over the noise, struggling to keep the bow into the waves. Every few seconds, the submarine's nose lifted high, then plunged down like a dying beast. For hours, they fought the storm. When it finally broke, the dawn came soft and gray, the sea calm again. The men emerged one by one, faces drawn and pale, but alive. Schäffer looked at them and said quietly, "If the sea wanted us gone, she would have taken us." No one replied. They all believed it. By mid-July, the submarine neared the coast of South America. The water grew warmer, the air heavier. Flying fish darted alongside the bow. Sometimes, at night, the sea itself glowed with bioluminescent plankton, a ghostly light trailing the U-boat's wake like a comet's tail. The crew had become quieter by then, changed somehow. They no longer spoke much of Germany, or the war, or even of home. The Atlantic had stripped away all politics, all purpose. What remained was a kind of raw, wordless brotherhood. There were moments of tenderness amid the fatigue. When one sailor fell ill from dehydration, another stayed by his side for days, spooning him water and whispering old lullabies. When someone's birthday passed, a young machinist named Hans, they shared the last bar of chocolate aboard, dividing it into 48 slivers. It wasn't celebration. It was survival made gentle. Then, one dawn, land appeared. A thin, pale line against the horizon. Argentina. Some of the crew wept. Others just stared in silence, unsure what to feel. They had been at sea for over 100 days, with no word from the outside world, no orders, no nation. Their uniforms were stiff with salt, their beards long, their eyes hollow. They were soldiers without a war, ghosts crossing into the realm of the living. As they drew closer to shore, the water shifted color, from deep indigo to a soft green-blue. The smell of earth and plants drifted on the wind. For the first time in months, the captain allowed himself to smile. "We made it," he said. But the question lingered unspoken among them, what now? On August 17, 1945, U-977 finally entered the harbor of Mar del Plata, Argentina. The port authorities were stunned. The war had been over for more than 3 months, yet here came a German submarine, surfacing like a relic of a forgotten age. The Argentine Navy surrounded the vessel, guns ready, unsure whether to welcome or arrest them. Schäffer stepped onto the deck, his uniform faded but still buttoned, his face expressionless. He raised his hands and said in halting Spanish, "We surrender to Argentina." And just like that, the long blue silence ended. News of the arrival spread across the world within hours. The Allies were furious and curious in equal measure. Why had a U-boat sailed across the entire Atlantic after Germany's surrender? Rumors exploded. Some said it carried Nazi gold, others that Hitler himself was aboard, having escaped his Berlin bunker. American intelligence rushed to investigate. The men were interrogated repeatedly. Schäffer was shipped to the United States, then to Britain, questioned for months. In the end, the truth was simpler, quieter, and more human. U-977 carried no treasure, no dictator, no secret mission. Only a crew of men who could not bear to surrender, who fled the collapse of their homeland and found a strange peace on the endless sea. In later years, Heinz Schäffer wrote a memoir, U-977, The Truth About the Undersea Escape to Argentina. It's a sparse, reflective book, not of glory, but of endurance. He never described himself as a hero, nor as a loyal Nazi. He was simply a sailor, trapped between duty and disbelief, trying to outswim a war that had already drowned the world. He lived quietly afterward, far from the ocean, his submarine days behind him. And yet, even now, in museums and naval archives, the name U-977 lingers like a whisper. Not because of what it carried, but because of what it symbolized, the final, drifting breath of a conflict that refused to end neatly. It was not a story of victory or defeat. It was a story of exhaustion, of men who kept going long after everything they knew had collapsed. In the silence between the waves, they found something like peace, fragile, fleeting, but real. When U-977 surfaced in Argentina that August morning, her conning tower streaked with salt and her hull rusted from the long voyage, the world above was already writing her legend before her crew even stepped ashore. The news spread like wildfire. A German U-boat, months after Germany's surrender, had appeared on the far side of the world. The war was over, Hitler was dead, or was he? The rumors began almost immediately, whispered first among dockworkers at Mar del Plata, then carried by reporters, then by entire nations. Some claimed they had seen a second submarine lurking nearby. Others swore that, just before dawn, a small raft had left U-977 and disappeared toward the Patagonian coast. And within days the rumor had taken on a new, electrifying shape. Adolf Hitler had escaped Europe, and U-977 had carried him to safety in South America. Captain Heinz Schäffer, exhausted and bewildered, denied it all. When Argentine officials asked him why he had come, his answer was simple, almost weary. We did not want to surrender to the Allies. We came here because the sea was our only road left. But his words, quiet and rational, were no match for the fever of post-war imagination. For a world that had spent 6 years watching cities burn and millions die, the idea that Hitler might have lived, might have fled, was both terrifying and irresistible. It was easier, in some strange way, to believe he was hiding, still plotting, than to accept that history's great monster had ended his life in a bunker surrounded by dust. So when U-977 appeared alone, from the depths of the Atlantic, it was as though the ocean itself had delivered the perfect symbol for that unease, a ghost from the Reich, surfacing on the edge of the known world. The interrogations began almost immediately. The Argentine Navy held the crew under tight watch, while Allied intelligence officers, American, British, and French, arrived one after another to question them. In Buenos Aires, newspapers printed maps of Patagonia with red circles, suggesting hidden Nazi colonies. Reporters spoke of secret lakes where German seaplanes landed at night, of mountain lodges where former SS officers drank wine under false names. Schäffer's every word was scrutinized. No, the Führer was not aboard. We saw no other submarine. We came because we did not want to surrender at sea. Still, the questions kept coming, and so did the theories. When another submarine, U-530, had surrendered in Argentina just weeks earlier, it seemed to confirm the idea of a coordinated escape. To the press, the coincidence was too strange to be mere chance. 2 U-boats, both arriving in Argentina after the war, both with stories that didn't quite add up. The imagination of a world starved for closure began to weave its own tapestry. In Europe, Allied intelligence officials grew increasingly uneasy. If Nazi submarines could reach Argentina, what else had escaped? There were rumors of Nazi gold hidden deep in Indian valleys, of scientists and officers slipping away under assumed names, of secret passages through Spain and Portugal feeding the underground routes to South America. The Americans called it the Retelling, a network of safe houses, forged passports, and sympathetic priests that smuggled fugitives from Europe to the southern hemisphere. And though much of it was indeed true, hundreds of former Nazis did find new lives in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. U-977's journey had, ironically, nothing to do with it. Schäffer and his men were neither smugglers nor conspirators. They were simply sailors who could not face surrender. But their voyage, innocent as it was, became the fuel that ignited one of history's most enduring myths, that Hitler had fled across the sea and lived on in exile. By the time Schäffer and his crew were transferred to the custody of the United States Navy, the story had grown beyond their control. The interrogations were relentless. In Washington, naval intelligence officers pressed Schäffer for details of his route, his cargo, his orders. He told them everything: the 66 days submerged, the rationing, the equatorial storm, the final days when their morale broke and they surfaced for good. The Americans listened, took notes, and at last came to the only reasonable conclusion: that the man was telling the truth. U-977 had not carried Hitler, nor gold, nor secret weapons. Only weary men running from the idea of surrender. And yet, outside the interrogation rooms, the myth refused to die. In Buenos Aires cafés, writers and adventurers whispered of hidden submarines deep in Patagonia's WWII lake, of strange German settlements in the forest where the locals spoke a language that wasn't Spanish. Fishermen told of seeing periscopes at dawn. Ranchers swore they'd glimpsed men in black coats vanishing into the trees. It was the birth of what would later be called the Hitler in Argentina legend, a story that would persist for decades, fed by paranoia, half-truths, and the human hunger for mystery. And at its heart lay one quiet, rusted vessel, U-977. Schäffer himself seemed almost haunted by what his voyage had become. In 1952, when he finally published his memoir, he began with a quiet plea. "I wish only to tell what truly happened, not the fantasies, not the propaganda. We were young, foolish perhaps, but we believed we could still choose our own fate." He described how the crew, after being released, returned to lives that no longer fit them. Some stayed in Argentina, taking work as mechanics or sailors. Others returned to Germany, to cities that no longer felt like home. For years afterward, Schäffer would receive letters, some congratulating him, others accusing him. One from Chile read, "I know the truth. You delivered him. Someday the world will thank you." Another, from a German widow, simply said, "My husband served on U-boat command. He would have been proud that at least one of you refused to bow." Schäffer kept both letters. In Argentina, the presence of former Nazis became an open secret. Some lived quietly, others boldly. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust, was captured there in 1960. Joseph Mengele, the infamous doctor of Auschwitz, passed through Argentina before vanishing into Brazil. And though none of these men had anything to do with U-977, the story of Schäffer's submarine continued to hover like a shadow behind them, proof, in the public imagination, that the sea had been a bridge between the fall of the Reich and the rebirth of its ghosts in another hemisphere. The myths had become a kind of folklore, dark, persistent, and strangely magnetic. Schäffer's later years were quiet. He returned to Europe, married, and lived a modest life, far from the ocean. When asked, he would still defend his decision to flee. "We were not cowards," he said once in an interview. "We were lost. There is a difference." He never again commanded a submarine. But in the small hours of the night, when he walked alone by the shore, he sometimes imagined the hum of diesel engines beneath the surf, the smell of oil and brine, the endless, forgiving blue. The sea, after all, had been both his prison and his salvation. And so, decades later, when historians speak of U-977, they do not speak of heroism or villainy. They speak of endurance, and of the strange twilight between war and peace, that lingering moment when men must decide whether to surrender or disappear. The submarine's journey became less about Hitler, and more about the men who tried to outswim the consequences of history. Beneath the myth, beneath the gossip and the fear, there remains something undeniably human, the desire to keep moving, even when the world has already ended. Before U-977 slipped through the Atlantic in her silent pilgrimage toward Argentina, Another submarine had already made the same journey, and arrived first. Her name was U-530, and she was older, battle-scarred, and by July 10, 1945, when she surfaced near Mar del Plata, she had already cast her shadow over every rumor that would later haunt Heinz Schäffer's crew. To the fishermen along the Argentine coast that morning, it must have been a strange and unsettling sight, a steel apparition rising from the blue, its conning tower blackened with soot, the decks glinting like the scales of a great sea creature. The war had been over for more than 2 months. The newspapers were filled with stories of occupation zones, reconstruction, and trials at Nuremberg. And yet here it was, a German submarine, alive, moving, silent. The harbor guards watched it for a long while before daring to approach. The captain of U-530, Otto Wermuth, was 25 years old, another young officer molded by desperation and discipline. When he finally emerged from the conning tower, his face was pale, drawn tight by fatigue. Behind him, 49 crewmen followed, stepping onto the deck with slow, deliberate movements, as if uncertain that the ground would hold. They were unarmed, unthreatening, but the mystery clung to them like fog. When asked why he had come, Wermuth's answer was simple, yet curiously vague. The war ended. We sought a neutral port. No logbooks were produced. No papers. No explanation for the long delay between Germany's surrender and their appearance. And so, as journalists crowded the docks, the rumors began to bloom again, dark, fast, unstoppable. The story of U-530 is inseparable from that of U-977. Together they became the twin pillars of a myth that still stirs fascination and suspicion even today. The idea that Nazi submarines, laden with gold, technology, or fugitives, slipped out of Europe at the war's end and scattered like seeds across the southern oceans. But unlike Schäffer's later voyage, U-530's story was murkier. She had left the North Atlantic in April 1945, after abandoning her mission to attack Allied shipping near New York. When Germany surrendered, Wermuth claimed, he destroyed his secret orders, jettisoned all ammunition, and decided to flee rather than surrender to the British or Americans. Yet what puzzled Allied investigators most was the missing time. Germany had capitulated on May 8. U-530 did not arrive in Argentina until July 10, 2 months later. Where had she been? Some speculated she had landed along the Brazilian coast, unloading cargo or passengers before continuing south. Others whispered that she had reached Patagonia, the lonely, wind-scarred edge of the world, where high cliffs and hidden inlets offered endless hiding places. And, of course, the wildest theory of all, that she had carried Hitler himself, or at least high-ranking officials of the Third Reich, to safety in the New World. In the interrogations that followed, Wermuth's story shifted and softened. He claimed they had drifted aimlessly after the surrender, unsure of what to do. He said the crew had simply wanted to survive, that they feared being sunk or shot if they tried to surrender at sea. But when American and British investigators examined the submarine, they found her scuttling charges missing, her radio equipment destroyed, her torpedoes gone. It was standard procedure to disarm a vessel before surrender, but to the Allied press, these absences hinted at something darker. Why destroy evidence if there was nothing to hide? And why wait so long before turning up? The newspapers began to weave the story for themselves. In London, one headline read, "Did Hitler escape by submarine?" Another, in Buenos Aires, declared, "2 German U-boats land in Argentina, Führer's escape possible." Even the sober voices of naval intelligence could not silence the rising hum of speculation. For the Argentine public, this was more than mere rumor, it was theater. The idea that their country might have become the refuge of defeated gods appealed to both curiosity and pride. Argentina in the mid-1940s was a land of contradictions, a nation half fascinated, half ashamed of its sympathy for the fallen Reich. President Juan Perón, with his nationalist vision and admiration for European militarism, quietly welcomed skilled German officers, scientists, and engineers. Factories needed builders. The army needed knowledge. And for men without a homeland, Argentina offered both work and silence. In that atmosphere, U-530's arrival was not a scandal but an omen, proof, some said, that the old order was not truly dead, merely exiled. Historians now know that many Nazi officials indeed used ratlins, clandestine escape routes through Italy and Spain, aided by sympathetic priests and Red Cross documents, to reach South America. But there is no solid evidence that U-530 carried any of them. She was merely the first of 2 lost vessels to wash up on Argentine shores, and by the time U-977 appeared 5 weeks later, the myth had already taken root like coral. The public mind loves patterns. 2 submarines. 2 young captains. Both fled instead of surrendering. Both arrived in the same neutral port. It was almost too perfect. When Schäffer was later interrogated, he was asked directly about U-530. His response was calm, perhaps even melancholy. We had no contact. I did not even know they had reached Argentina until we arrived ourselves. But I am not surprised. Many of us were afraid. The sea was the last refuge we knew. There is a strange tenderness in those words, the quiet acceptance that fear, not fanaticism, drove these men south. They were not loyal to the collapsing Reich, nor to Hitler's ghost. They were loyal to survival, and to the sea that promised it. In later decades, divers and treasure hunters scoured the cold southern waters, chasing the phantom of the Nazi gold fleet. Some claimed to have found rusting submarines buried in silt off the coast of Patagonia. Others insisted the true cargo of U-530 and U-977 was not gold or generals, but knowledge, secret technology smuggled out before Berlin fell. Jet engine blueprints, rocket parts, uranium ore, the list of supposed treasures was endless. Each claim refuted, each rumor reborn. The truth was simpler and sadder. The submarines were empty of everything except exhaustion. They had carried no treasure but men, and those men carried only the heavy silence of defeat. One Argentine officer, who had been present when U-530's crew was taken ashore, later wrote in his journal, "They looked like ghosts. Their faces were hollow, their uniforms stiff with salt. I remember one man clutching a rusted wrench as if it were his only proof that he still had a purpose. None spoke as they walked. They moved like sleepwalkers." That image, preserved in an obscure naval archive, speaks more truth than all the rumors combined. The sea had stripped them bare, not just of weapon and flag, but of identity. When both U-530 and U-977 were finally handed over to the United States, they were examined, photographed, and then quietly sunk off the coast of New England as test targets. No relics remain of their hulls, only grainy photographs and the faint echo of engines in yellowed logs. But their stories endured, intertwining like twin wakes across the sea, 2 voyages that began as acts of fear and ended as legends. In the quiet of his later years, Heinz Schäffer reflected on U-530's captain with a tone of reluctant kinship. "We never met, but we were brothers of circumstance. Each of us made the same mistake, to think that the sea could forget what the land could not. It is a haunting thought, that beneath the political noise and conspiracy, these 2 submarines represented something far more universal, the human wish to start again, even if the starting point is exile. In the darkness of the deep, where history's noise cannot reach, that longing becomes almost holy." And so the 2 U-boats became the last whispers of the Kriegsmarine, not warriors but fugitives, gliding through the fading echo of the war. To this day, when storms sweep the South Atlantic, fishermen sometimes speak of hearing strange metallic groans from below, or of shapes that vanish beneath the waves. Maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe, as one old sailor in Mar del Plata once said, the ghosts of the German boats are still looking for home. When the guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945, the echoes did not fade evenly. In Argentina, the silence that followed was filled not with mourning, but with whispers. Whispers of German submarines that had vanished into the Atlantic. Of airplanes that had landed secretly in Patagonia under the cover of night. Of strangers in German coats, seen in the highlands, speaking softly and paying in Reichsmarks. It was the kind of rumor that grows best where distance and mystery already thrive, and few places on earth are as vast and unknowable as southern Argentina, where the pampas roll into misty forests, and the Andes rise like a broken crown. For most of the world, the war was over. For Argentina, it was merely changing its uniform. The government of Juan Domingo Perón, then newly rising in power, was more than willing to give the past a second life. Perón admired the discipline, the efficiency, and above all, the technological sophistication of the German war machine. And so, as Europe's ruins still smoldered, ships began to cross the Atlantic, not with troops, but with scientists, engineers, doctors, and pilots, all seeking refuge in the southern hemisphere. Some came through official channels with new identities, aided by the Catholic Church and the Red Cross, who provided travel papers for displaced persons. Others arrived more quietly, stepping off merchant vessels in the dark, or being ferried ashore from waiting submarines. They were not all war criminals, though some most certainly were. Many were simply men who feared retribution, men who had served a cause that no longer existed. But to the Argentine people, they were something stranger, an invisible inheritance of the Reich, ghosts walking in daylight. The Andes Mountains became their wall of silence. Hidden in the folds of Patagonia, they found valleys so remote that even the postal routes had no names for them. In Bariloche, a lakeside town with Bavarian architecture and alpine air, German was spoken freely. Inns bore names like Haus Edelweiss and Gasthof Tyrol. Children with blue eyes and German surnames went to school under the portrait of Perón. It was, in some eerie way, a Europe reborn at the edge of the world. Locals would later claim that, in the late 1940s, unfamiliar faces began appearing in those mountains, older men with nervous habits, who spoke little and never stayed in one place long. One fisherman swore he'd seen a submarine surface briefly off the coast of Puerto Madryn, far from any naval base. Another told a journalist that a German doctor had moved into an old stone house in the hills, treating the locals for free but never revealing his past. The stories multiplied faster than they could be disproved. By the time U-977 arrived in August 1945, Argentina was ready for her, not militarily, but psychologically. The people had already made room in their imagination for the idea of Nazis in exile. The newspapers were filled with speculation. Was U-977 the same submarine that had spirited Hitler away? Was Schäffer guarding a secret he dared not tell? The captain himself would later write that he was treated respectfully, even kindly, by the Argentine Navy. But in the days that followed his surrender, the press frenzy grew feverish. One Buenos Aires daily wrote, "2 submarines have come, and who knows how many more are yet beneath the waves. Perhaps in Patagonia, the Reich begins anew." Behind those words lay a kernel of truth. For in those years, Argentina did quietly become a haven for hundreds, perhaps thousands, of former Nazis and collaborators. Among them was Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, who lived for years under a false name, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory in Buenos Aires until the Mossad found him in 1960. There was also Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, from Auschwitz, who escaped justice entirely, dying in Brazil decades later. To harbor such men, willingly or not, required a national blindness, a decision to look away in exchange for what they could offer: expertise, connections, a sense of prestige. But in the popular imagination, these quiet exiles and the mysterious submarines became one and the same, all part of the same great, dark migration of the defeated. And yet, for all the smoke and speculation, what emerged most clearly was not proof of a Nazi resurrection, but the power of myth in the age of radio and fear. To a war-weary world, the idea that Hitler or his closest followers had escaped was intoxicating. It gave people a reason to stay vigilant, a villain still lurking in the shadows. And to those who had lost everything, the myth offered a strange comfort, that somewhere, order still existed, if only in hiding. For Schäffer and his crew, though, the myth became a burden. They were interrogated repeatedly, first by the Argentine Navy, then by the Americans. Every conversation circled back to the same question. Did you carry passengers? Did you rendezvous with another ship? Did you see U-530? Each time, Schäffer's answers were the same: no, no, and no. In his memoir U-977, 66 Days Underwater, written years later, he tried to set the record straight. We brought no one but ourselves. We carried no gold, no generals, no Führer. Only our fear, and the weight of a war we could not end. But by then, no one wanted the truth. The legend had already taken on a life of its own. Historians who later studied these stories noticed something curious. The further one traveled from Europe, the more elaborate the tales became. In Patagonia, locals told of entire hidden bases in the mountains, where German engineers tested aircraft. In Chile, fishermen claimed to have seen strange lights over the sea, sometimes red, sometimes blue, moving faster than any known plane. A few even whispered of an Antarctic refuge, where submarines had carried Nazi scientists to build a secret fortress beneath the ice. None of it was true, of course. But it didn't have to be. In a world just learning what nuclear power could do, the idea of secret German technology surviving somewhere on the edge of the world felt not only possible, but inevitable. Meanwhile, Argentina's German-speaking communities thrived quietly. Some of the exiles became teachers, machinists, or shopkeepers. Others took their secrets to the grave. By the 1960s, the old sailors of U-977 were aging men living ordinary lives. Heinz Schäffer returned to Germany, became a ship's captain in the merchant navy, and later a writer. He never again spoke publicly of the voyage that had made him infamous. But even he understood that, in the end, his journey was not just about a submarine escaping the war. It was about a nation's need to believe that some pieces of the old world had survived. In the decades since, divers, historians, and treasure seekers have scoured the southern oceans for proof, any proof, that the rumors were real. Rusting hulls have been found off the coasts of Uruguay and Argentina, but none belong to the missing U-boats. Still, every few years, a new article appears, a new theory whispered. A submarine was seen off Tierra del Fuego. Fishermen found metal debris older than the war. Someone in Bariloche still remembers seeing a German plane land in '46. And each time, the myth resurfaces, polished by memory, buoyed by distance. For the people of Argentina, it became part of the landscape, as familiar as the wind off the mountains. The idea that history had left a secret buried beneath the southern seas was almost comforting. Because perhaps, in that secret, there was still a connection to something greater, to a world that had vanished, but not entirely died. And for the men of U-977, who had crossed an ocean only to find themselves trapped in legend, perhaps that was the final irony. They fled the Reich to escape its shadow. But the shadow followed them anyway, across the Atlantic, through the mountains, and into the midst of a continent. In photographs taken after his surrender, Heinz Schäffer looks strangely untroubled. His face is lean, his eyes tired but calm, the expression of a man who has already spent too much time in silence to fear it any longer. The creases around his eyes tell of sleepless nights under red lights, of the endless hum of engines 50 meters beneath the sea. To look at him, one would hardly guess that this quiet, neat officer had just commanded one of the last German submarines of the war. Nor that his name would soon drift into myth, tangled forever with the whispers of a vanished Reich. He had, after all, only been 26 years old when he guided U-977 across the Atlantic, barely older than his youngest crewman. But the journey had aged them all. When he stepped onto Argentine soil in August 1945, He was greeted not with bullets or chains, but bewildered courtesy. The local naval officers, uncertain what to do with these pale, exhausted sailors, offered food, water, and clean clothes. For the first time in months, Schäffer and his men slept without the sound of machinery in their ears. And yet, even as he rested, he knew what awaited him next. Interrogation. It came in waves, first in Argentina, then aboard the U.S. destroyer that carried him north. Each question the same, spoken in different accents. Why did you flee? Were you ordered to go to South America? Did you carry passengers, or cargo? Was Hitler aboard your submarine? He had been rehearsing his answers for weeks. I did not flee to save the Reich. I fled to save my crew. We carried no one. No cargo, no gold, no fugitives. We wanted to surrender in peace, far from the chaos of occupied Europe. The interrogators listened. They took notes. They asked again. Each time, he told them the same story, the same truth, or at least the same version of truth he could live with. What haunted Schäffer most was not disbelief, but the persistence of rumor. In the weeks after U-977's arrival, newspapers across the world had printed wild claims that 2 U-boats had delivered Hitler and Eva Braun to Patagonia, that secret orders from Berlin had directed them south, that Argentina was sheltering the remnants of the Reich. To an exhausted world, the story was irresistible. Germany had fallen too suddenly, too neatly. Its leaders had vanished without spectacle. For millions, the idea that Hitler had died in a bunker was unsatisfying, a dull ending to a nightmare that had defined their lives. And so they searched for a grander finale. A hidden one. U-977, by arriving when and where it did, became the perfect vessel for that fantasy. When Schäffer was transferred to the United States for further questioning, he found himself sitting in bright, airless rooms before officers who had read those same headlines. They asked about U-530, another German submarine that had surrendered in Argentina a month earlier. Did you coordinate your voyage? Did you rendezvous in the South Atlantic? Did you transfer passengers? Again and again, he denied it. But when he mentioned the idea that some of his men wanted to go to Argentina because they had heard the country was friendly to Germans, his interrogators seized on the word friendly. They asked, almost gently, whether he had been ordered by higher command to establish contact with sympathetic officials. He said no. But even he began to sense the futility of his denials. Truth, once tangled in myth, seldom surfaces again. After his release in 1947, Schäffer returned to Germany, a nation shattered not just by bombs, but by disbelief. The ruins of Hamburg, Berlin, and Cologne looked like the inside of his mind, cracked, hollow, half-flooded with silence. He tried to rebuild a life. He took work in the merchant marine, sailing across seas that no longer frightened him. The rhythm of the engines, once a heartbeat of war, became again the pulse of ordinary life. But wherever he went, the past followed. Journalists sent letters. Historians wanted interviews. The questions were never about torpedoes or tactics, only about the voyage. About the mystery. He was, unwillingly, a myth's custodian. In 1952, tired of the distortions, he wrote his own account, U-977, 66 Days Underwater. It was a careful, restrained book, free of embellishment. He described the long voyage in patient detail, the claustrophobia, the boredom, the unrelenting sameness of the sea. He wrote of the men, their quarrels, their jokes, their silence. He wrote of the moment when they surfaced, exhausted and hollow-eyed, off the coast of Argentina. But he avoided dramatics. There was no mention of secret cargo, no hint of conspiracy. In one passage he wrote, "I do not ask to be believed, only to be remembered as a sailor, not a ghost." It was a plea for simplicity, but simplicity seldom sells. The book was read politely by scholars, passionately by conspiracy theorists, and unevenly by everyone else. Some said it confirmed his innocence. Others said it was exactly the kind of thing a guilty man would write. And so the myth endured. As the years passed, the legend of U-977 fused with countless other post-war rumors of lost gold, secret Antarctic bases, and the Fourth Reich hiding beneath the ice. Schäffer himself lived quietly, remarrying, traveling, and finally retiring near the sea. He never again commanded a submarine, but he sometimes visited museums or naval reunions, where younger officers would shake his hand with shy curiosity. To them, he was not a war criminal, nor even a hero, just a survivor of something enormous and unrepeatable. But every now and then, someone would ask, half-whispered, "Captain, did Hitler really die in Berlin?" And Schäffer would sigh and smile faintly, as if at an old superstition. "Yes," he would say. "He died there. But his shadow took the long way home." There's a photograph of him from the late 1960s, standing on the deck of a merchant ship, sunlight glinting off the rails. He looks older now, his hair silvered by salt. His face has softened, though the same quiet eyes remain. Looking at that picture, one senses a man who has lived both too long and not long enough to escape himself. He knew that in every tavern by the docks, in every coastal town from Hamburg to Buenos Aires, someone still whispered his story, not as history, but as folklore. And perhaps that was fitting. Because folklore, after all, is what happens when history refuses to die. Schäffer died in 1979, quietly, without ceremony. There were no headlines, no grand retrospectives. Just a brief obituary in a Hamburg newspaper noting that Heinz Schäffer, former naval officer and author, passed away at the age of 60. But in death, as in life, the silence around him did not last. In the 1980s, as the Cold War reignited the world's appetite for secrets, his story resurfaced. Documentaries speculated again about Hitler's escape. Writers recycled the myth of the ghost submarines. U-977 was once more invoked, not as a real vessel, but as a symbol of the unknowable depths of history. Schäffer had become immortal in the one way he never wanted, as a question that could never be answered. Even today, when divers descend into the cold waters off South America and find the wrecks of forgotten ships, someone always asks, "Could it be one of them? One of the missing U-boats?" They never are. But that doesn't matter. The legend remains, floating just below the surface, like a shadow seen from a submarine's periscope. And perhaps, if there is any comfort in that, it is this: that for a brief, flickering moment in the long twilight after the war, one small crew believed they could escape history's reach, and in doing so, they became part of it. When the hatches of U-977 were sealed for the final time, the men who had sailed her were no longer aboard. The sea that had once been her refuge had become her executioner. It was late 1946 when the decision was made: U-977 would be sunk deliberately by the United States Navy. She had crossed the Atlantic, defied surrender, survived depth charges and famine, only to meet her end not in battle, but as a test subject in Operation Deadlight, the mass scuttling of captured German U-boats. There was something almost ceremonial about it, this destruction of the iron beasts that had once haunted the world's oceans. They were towed, one by one, from ports in Northern Ireland and Scotland to deep water in the North Atlantic, stripped of identifying marks, and sent beneath the waves. For the Allies it was both practical and symbolic, an exorcism of the ghosts of war. But for historians, and perhaps for the sea itself, it felt like an act of quiet tragedy, a closing of stories that had not yet finished being told. U-977 had been taken across the Atlantic by the U.S. Navy after her surrender in Argentina. She had been studied, measured, inspected, her pressure hull examined, her engineering admired. For all its terror, the German U-boat was a marvel of design. Sleek, efficient, and deadly, it had changed the nature of naval warfare forever. American engineers noted the subtle differences: The rubber coating on her hull that reduced sonar reflection, the clever layout of her controls, the endurance that allowed her to stay submerged for 2 months straight. Even stripped of its weapons, U-977 was still a symbol of ingenuity. And yet, her fate had already been written in bureaucratic ink, to be used for target practice or sunk in deep water. In the archives at the U.S. Naval Historical Center, there exists a simple typewritten note dated November 1946. Subject: Disposition of German submarine U-977, per order of Commandant, to be included in Operation Deadlight, Atlantic Disposal Area 3. No ceremony. No sentiment. Just coordinates and a date. The war had turned even its relics into data. If you close your eyes and imagine it, the grey Atlantic off Northern Ireland, the cold wind slicing over the water, the cranes lifting rusted steel into place, you can almost see her again, the submarine that fled the Reich. She sits low in the water, her decks worn, her paint blistered from sun and salt. American sailors, in peacoats and gloves, work silently, securing cables and adjusting valves. One of them, perhaps out of curiosity, walks along the narrow conning tower and peers down the hatch, the same hatch through which Heinz Schäffer had climbed months before, stepping out into sunlight and surrender. Inside, the air still smells faintly of oil and metal. The dials are in German. The switches, though labeled in another language, feel strangely universal. A relic of another world, preserved and doomed at once. The towing vessel, an old British destroyer, moves into position. A small flag, the Union Jack, flutters at her stern. There is no music, no salute. Only the cold drone of the wind and the hum of the engines. At precisely 0945 hours, the order is given. Cables strain. The destroyer slowly moves forward, dragging U-977 out to sea. Behind her, gulls circle, shrieking as if protesting the indignity of it. By noon, the coast is gone. Only the rolling Atlantic remains. The same ocean that had carried her so far in defiance now carries her to her end. At 1,400 hours, charges are set. A brief countdown. Then a deep, muffled explosion beneath the waves. Witnesses later said that she didn't sink immediately, that for a few moments the stern rose slightly, as though reluctant to go, before the sea folded over her. One of the officers aboard the towing ship wrote in his log, "The submarine went down slowly, quietly, as if at peace. No plume, no smoke. Only a circle of foam where she had been." And that was how U-977, the wanderer of the Atlantic, ended, not in combat or chaos, but in stillness. A steel coffin resting on the seabed, its logbooks long since confiscated, its secrets reduced to silence. For years afterward, her coordinates were marked on naval maps as a mere curiosity. Wreck depth approximates 700 meters. Fishermen crossing those waters sometimes reported their sonar pinging off something below, a shadow among the deep. None knew the story of the vessel they passed over, a submarine that had once been a rumor, a scandal, a vessel of myth. Now it was only another reef, another ghost in the Atlantic's quiet cathedral. When I once stood on the cliffs of Donegal and looked out toward that part of the sea, the horizon was empty and gray. But as the wind hissed through the grass, I thought of her, of the men who had lived inside her, breathing recycled air, dreaming of sunlight. There's something almost sacred about the way the ocean takes things. It erases them, yes, but it also keeps them, preserves them in darkness, holds them in currents. Down there, in the cold dark, U-977 sleeps beside hundreds of her kind, each one a story, each one a silence. By the 1950s, divers and historians began cataloging the wrecks of Operation Deadlight. Some were found twisted and torn, others eerily intact. Each discovery brought a brief flicker of recognition, a chance to touch the past, to feel the cold steel that once carried lives and legends. But U-977 was not among the ones recovered. Her resting place remained uncertain, perhaps too deep, perhaps simply forgotten among the coordinates. In a way, it was fitting. For a vessel born in secrecy, doomed in rumor, there could be no more appropriate fate than to vanish completely, leaving only stories in her wake. Years later, when Heinz Schäffer was asked if he ever thought about the submarine, he said quietly, "Every sailor thinks of his ship. Even when it is gone. Especially then." And perhaps that's true of all who survive, soldiers, sailors, nations alike. We bury what we cannot bear, and then we build legends over the graves. If you listen closely to the old sailors in Hamburg or Kiel, or the fishermen of Patagonia, they'll still tell you. The sea remembers everything. It remembers the U-boats, the convoys, the flares at night, the depth-charge echoes that rolled through the hulls like thunder. And it remembers U-977, the last wanderer, not for what she carried, but for the strange, impossible hope of those who sailed her into exile. A hope that, somewhere beyond war, there might still be a shore untouched by history. Even now, when the sonar pings through those deep waters, sometimes a faint shape returns, curved, hollow, almost human in outline. And for a moment, one might imagine the ghost of U-977 drifting through the blue-black dark, her engines silent, her compass fixed eternally southward. As if still sailing toward Argentina? By the time U-977 had vanished beneath the Atlantic, her physical story had ended. But her legend was only beginning. In the years that followed the war, whispers began to drift through cafes, naval bars, and intelligence circles alike, whispers that not all the U-boats had surrendered. Some, people said, had disappeared. Entire flotillas of them, bound not for Germany's ports or Allied hands, but for some secret refuge in the south, a hidden Nazi enclave in Patagonia, or beneath the glaciers of Antarctica. It sounds absurd today, a fantasy stitched from post-war paranoia and pulp magazines. But in the anxious quiet of 1946, when the world was still bruised and uncertain, it didn't feel impossible. At the heart of those rumors was a single fact: U-977 had arrived in Argentina long after the war ended. She was proof that a U-boat could cross the Atlantic unseen. So if one submarine could do it, why not 10? Why not 100? The world had just watched Germany unravel with frightening efficiency. It wasn't hard to imagine that some of its most loyal servants had planned an escape. The story spread like frost on glass, starting from small Argentine papers, then winding through international headlines. Nazi submarine reaches Buenos Aires. Did Hitler flee Europe by sea? By August 1945, when U-530 and U-977 had both surfaced in Argentina within weeks of each other, it seemed to confirm the wildest suspicions. To many, the implication was simple: the Führer had escaped. It didn't help that Heinz Schäffer refused, at first, to explain exactly why he had fled. When pressed by reporters and interrogators, his answers were careful, too careful. He insisted he was merely avoiding capture, that he wanted to surrender on his own terms. But when asked whether he had carried passengers, important passengers, he gave no direct reply. The silence was enough. Rumor is always fed more by what's left unsaid than by what's spoken. In Buenos Aires, a curious kind of hysteria took hold. German immigrants whispered of submarines unloading crates along remote Patagonian shores. Fishermen swore they had seen strange lights under the water. One Argentine newspaper even claimed that Adolf Hitler himself had arrived by U-boat, disguised and spirited away to a mountain villa near Bariloche. The story was preposterous, but intoxicating, the perfect myth for a world not yet ready to believe in closure. Soon, U-977 became the symbol of that myth. Her 66-day submerged voyage turned into 116, then 200, then unknown months. Each retelling grew darker, grander, more cinematic. She was no longer just a submarine, she was a vessel of secrets. By the 1950s, conspiracy writers began to connect U-977 to the growing fascination with Antarctica, the last blank space on the post-war map. The theory went that during the war, the Nazis had established a secret Antarctic base, New Schwabenland, where advanced technology, and perhaps the remnants of the regime, had retreated. And if the Nazis had escaped, what better ship to carry them there than the elusive U-977? The idea was pure fantasy, of course. But like all good legends, it contained just enough truth to sound almost possible. After all, German expeditions really had explored parts of Antarctica in 1938–39. And the U-boats really had extraordinary range. U-977's voyage to Argentina proved that. So, in smoky bars and Cold War propaganda circles, the myth took root. The Fourth Reich sleeps beneath the ice. Heinz Schäffer himself found the rumors both absurd and irritating. In 1952, he published a memoir titled U-977, 66 Days Underwater, attempting to tell his version of events and put the conspiracies to rest. He described the hardships, the suffocating air, the unending darkness, the strange, hollow quiet of life submerged. He wrote of the fear that any surface attempt might bring Allied aircraft upon them. And he described, with almost poetic exhaustion, the moment they finally saw the Argentine coast. It was not a triumph, he insisted, it was surrender in slow motion. But the world was no longer interested in facts. By the 1960s, pulp writers and sensationalist magazines had already woven U-977 into the tapestry of post-war myth. They claimed her true mission was to deliver Nazi gold, or scientists, or even biological specimens to secret hideouts in South America. Some said she carried Eva Braun, others said Hitler himself had been aboard, slipping into obscurity under the name Sebastian Müller. Even as Schäffer toured Europe giving talks to set the record straight, the legends multiplied faster than truth could catch them. It's easy, in hindsight, to mock those stories. But in the fragile years after 1945, when half the world lay in ruins and the other half was already dividing itself into Cold War paranoia, people needed mysteries. They needed to believe that something as monstrous as the Third Reich couldn't simply end with a gunshot in a Berlin bunker. That evil, or genius, depending on one's lens, must have escaped, hidden somewhere, waiting. And so U-977 became not just a submarine, but a symbol of denial, of fascination, of humanity's refusal to let the past sink quietly. There's a strange symmetry to it. Heinz Schäffer had fled because he wanted to avoid humiliation, to end his war not as a prisoner, but as a free man. Yet his flight gave birth to the very myths that ensured his name would never be forgotten. In trying to escape the war, he had become a part of its afterlife. Today, divers and naval historians treat U-977 with a kind of reverence. She represents both the extraordinary endurance of the human body and the fragile nature of human truth. On one hand, she is a feat of engineering and navigation, a 66-day underwater journey unmatched in its time. On the other, she is a reminder of how swiftly truth drowns in the tides of storytelling. For every historian tracing the true path of U-977 through naval logs, there's another storyteller charting her imagined descent into Antarctic catacombs. Standing in a maritime museum in Hamburg, I once saw a small relic, a pressure gauge marked U-977. It was corroded, its glass cracked, but you could still read the faded numbers. A label beneath it read simply, "Recovered from the wreck area, Operation Deadlight, 1946. I remember thinking how strange it was that such a small, silent thing had caused so much noise. That a single submarine, born from a dying empire, could still stir questions 80 years later. And perhaps that's the truth of U-977's legend. It's not about what she carried or where she went, but about what people needed her to mean. To some, she was evidence of conspiracy, the dark tendrils of Nazism lingering beyond defeat. To others, she was a parable of endurance, of men adrift in the long shadow of war. And to the sea, she was just another wreck, iron returning to the deep, stories dissolving into salt. When the sonar scans sweep across her resting place now, they reveal only a faint outline, half buried in silt. No treasure, no passengers, no secrets. Only the shape of a machine and the echo of a journey. But listen carefully, and perhaps you'll still hear it. The steady thrum of diesel engines, the muffled heartbeat of men who once believed they could outrun history. And for a moment, just before sleep, the Atlantic itself seems to whisper. Southward. Always southward. In the years that followed, Heinz Schäffer lived a quiet life, far from the roar of engines and the stifling air of submarines. He settled into a kind of obscurity that felt almost deliberate, as though he wanted the world to forget his name. The sea, however, rarely forgets. When I first read his memoir, U-977, 66 Days Underwater, I was struck not by the technical detail or wartime accounts, but by the silences between the lines. There's a certain poetry to the way he describes darkness. Like a soft, endless fabric wrapped around the soul. His words are weary, reflective, not defensive. It's the language of a man who had too much time to think, submerged in a steel cylinder where days and nights had long lost their meaning. In that darkness, Schäffer was no longer a soldier of the Reich. He was just another man, frightened, trapped, uncertain of what awaited above. When U-977 surrendered, the world had already turned a page. The flags he once served no longer existed. His uniform, his loyalty, even his purpose had all become relics overnight. And yet, for all the suspicion and myth that followed, Schäffer's crew was treated, in the end, as sailors, not villains. The Argentine authorities held them briefly before handing them over to the Americans, who interrogated them at length. There was no evidence of secret cargo, no trace of escaped Nazis or smuggled treasure. Just exhausted men, pale from months without sunlight, their hair grown wild, their bodies thin from rationed food and recycled air. They spoke not of loyalty to Hitler or devotion to a lost cause, but of survival, of choosing one last voyage over surrender, of drifting southward because it felt like freedom, however fleeting. When Operation Deadlight began in 1946, the Allied program to scuttle hundreds of surrendered German submarines, U-977 was among those marked for destruction. She was towed out into the cold North Atlantic, her hull still intact, her systems barely operational. A British destroyer stood nearby as charges were set. There was no ceremony, no salute. The Grey Sea accepted her without protest. One moment she floated scarred but whole, the next, her bow tilted downward, water rushing through open hatches. Within minutes, the submarine that had haunted headlines around the world was gone, swallowed by the same ocean that had once carried her to freedom. I often imagine that final descent. Not as a violent ending, but as something peaceful, inevitable. The sea, after all, has always been the final archive of human ambition. Every ship that ever sailed still lingers somewhere below, quiet and half-forgotten. For Heinz Schäffer, the years after the war were quieter, though perhaps not kinder. He tried, more than once, to explain his decisions, to distance himself from the ideology that had consumed his country. In his later writings and interviews, he spoke not of glory or pride, but of the moral exhaustion of youth trained to obey. He said that when he heard of Germany's surrender, he felt neither relief nor defeat, only emptiness. A strange, unanchored silence, as though the noise of war had stopped but left a ringing in his mind that never truly faded. He spent much of his later life in Austria, working modest jobs, raising a family, trying to live without being defined by a single voyage. Yet the legend followed him like a shadow. No matter how much time passed, newspapers and documentarians would come knocking, asking about the long underwater journey, about the mystery of the South Atlantic, about Hitler's escape, questions that had long since worn him down. He died in 1979, just shy of his 60th birthday. His obituary was short, a paragraph in a Viennese paper, noting merely that he had been the commander of U-977, and that his book had become a curiosity among naval historians. But I like to think he found peace in the end. Sometimes, when I read accounts from surviving U-boat sailors, I sensed that same melancholy in their voices, a mixture of pride and regret, reverence and sorrow. They were young, often barely 20, fighting in a war that consumed their generation. Their battlefield was invisible, claustrophobic, and merciless. One veteran once described it to me as a war fought in slow motion. He said, "We didn't see the enemy. We only felt him, in the depth charges, in the groan of the hull." That sense of unseen fear lingered long after the war ended. Even decades later they spoke of the sea as though it were alive, a witness that remembered every scream and silence alike. In many ways, the story of U-977 is not about defiance, or heroism, or even escape. It is about what happens to men when the world they knew collapses, and all they can do is drift away from the ruins. It is about the long shadow of duty, and how easily duty becomes burden. For the men aboard that submarine, the war did not end on May 8, 1945. It ended slowly, painfully, in the still air of the South Atlantic, where time itself seemed to hesitate. I imagine them emerging onto the deck after those 66 submerged days, blinking against the sunlight, the salt wind biting their faces. I imagine how strange the sky must have looked, vast, endless, and suddenly free of smoke. Perhaps, for a brief moment, they felt the war lift off their shoulders, dissolving into the horizon. What remains of U-977 now lies deep under the Atlantic, among the other dead machines of the 20th century. Her hull is rusting quietly in the cold dark, her instruments frozen in time. Fish drift through her corridors, and silt covers the numbers once painted proudly along her bow. No crew remains to tell her story firsthand. Only the documents, the interrogation transcripts, and the fading words of Heinz Schäffer survive, a captain who ran from the war, but could never quite outrun its memory. And perhaps that's what draws us, even now, to tales like his. Not the myths of secret bases or hidden gold, but the quieter, human truth beneath them. The story of a man caught between obedience and conscience, survival and surrender, memory and forgetting. The world moves on, but the ocean does not. It keeps its secrets well. If you ever find yourself standing at the shore of the South Atlantic, somewhere along the long Argentine coast, listen closely. You might hear nothing but the wind and the slow crash of waves. Yet in the rhythm of the surf, there is an echo, a distant hum, like an old engine still turning beneath the deep. It is not the sound of war, nor of glory, but of something gentler, remembrance. Because even the deadliest machines can, in time, become quiet ghosts, drifting between history and myth, remembered not for what they destroyed, but for what they endured. And that is how I like to think of U-977. Not as a vessel of escape, nor as the final refuge of tyranny, but as a weary ship that carried the last breath of a dying war into the waiting arms of the sea. Beneath the waves, time does not rush. It drifts. Light bends, sound softens, and history moves like dust through water, gentle, patient, unhurried. Down there, the machines of men sleep among the bones of whales and the husks of coral. The wars they fought no longer matter, only the stories remain, flickering faintly like lanterns on the ocean floor. U-977 rests among them, her steel now more reef than weapon. The barnacles cling to her sides like medals awarded by the sea itself. Sometimes, when storms roll across the South Atlantic, the waves above her rise like breathing. It feels almost as if the ocean remembers, not the politics or the borders, but the men. Always the men. The young sailor staring into the sonar's glow. The captain tracing his course by instinct and fear. The mechanic whispering to a broken valve in the dark. They are all gone now, but their presence lingers, not in the noise of the world, but in its silence. And perhaps, if one listens long enough to that silence, one might hear what Heinz Schäffer must have felt in his final hours aboard the U-boat. That the sea, vast and endless, forgives everything. The water swallows the iron and the guilt alike. It takes the stories of triumph and shame and carries them down where no judgment can reach. And so it ends not with thunder, but with a sigh. The engines fade. The compass slows. The last light flickers, and all that remains is peace, a quiet, enduring peace that even war cannot undo.